Well, it is indeed an honor for me to welcome Oregon's Secretary of State, Phil Keisling, to the City Club podium today. I don't know the official designation for a secretary, whether it's your worship, your... Phil. Phil Keisling was born in Portland and grew up in Washington County. He graduated from Beaverton Sunset High School and then from Yale University. He should probably have returned to Beaverton and joined the Nike people, but no. Instead, he developed some substantial Oregon experience, which has included speech writing for Governor Tom McCall, reporting for Willamette Week newspaper, editing the Washington Monthly magazine in Washington, D.C., and then serving as the senior legislative assistant for then Oregon House Speaker Vera Katz. Feeling confident and somewhat trained, Phil Keisling then ran for and won an Oregon legislative House seat, which he maintained until 1991, at which time he was appointed Oregon's Secretary of State. He has retained that position through election ever since. As Secretary of State, Secretary Keisling is auditor of our public accounts, manager of the state's official records, and our chief elections officer. In that capacity, as the elections officer, he has crafted Oregon's 1991 legislative redistricting plan, and he has worked diligently to increase voter registration and participation, and has actively expanded vote by mail, as we all know. His other interests and responsibilities have brought him to this podium before to debate such things as the initiative process. Today, Secretary Keisling brings his experience and his unique vantage point to bear as he reviews the present legislative session, describes some of its actions, and tells us how he feels the apathy of what he calls the new radical middle influences the power of the passionate periphery. Please join me in recognizing and listening to Oregon's Secretary of State, Phil Keisling.
Well, Fran, I appreciate the introduction. I've been called a lot of things in this business, never some of those, and I appreciate it. It's a delight to be back here at the City Club with the task of trying to comment on the 1997 legislative session that just adjourned a week ago. And as I found myself thinking about this topic, a funny thing happened. I kept thinking about Uzbekistan. You see, about midway through the session, a friend asked a favor. Could I address about 80 foreign exchange students that were coming to the Capitol? Now, these situations are very hard to resist, especially since it gives me an occasion to tell an oft-told story that my friend Monroe Sweetland, who happens to be here today, is involved in. It seems Monroe ran for Secretary of State back in 1956 against a then obscure state senator named Mark Hatfield, and felt his campaign was going quite well, particularly in the last few days when he was in the Milwaukee post office and two elderly women immediately warmed to his candidacy. "You betcha we'll vote for you as Secretary of State," they exclaimed. And then one proceeded to turn to the other and say, "Yep, that John Foster Dulles has just got to go." Well, I explained to these 80 students that I had nothing to do with foreign policy, although one actually did ask my opinion on the Helms-Burton Act. But these students were from all continents, first, second, third world countries: Germany, Russia, New Zealand, China, Korea, India, Ghana, Morocco. And we were having a very lively discussion about elections, and suddenly something dawned on me. I said, "I'm curious, how many of you know at least 3 languages?" And everyone raised their hand. 4? Well over half. How many of you feel how many of you have a longer school year in your home country than what you have here in the United States? Again, every hand in the room went up. And then I asked, how many of you feel more challenged in your classes that you're taking here in the United States with our top students than you do in your home country? The entire room literally burst into laughter. A woman stood up and said, I'm from Uzbek. I am a senior now, and I am taking coursework here that I took in 9th grade. Meanwhile, just down the hall, the Oregon House of Representatives was engaged in an hours-long impassioned debate on a bill encouraging school districts to offer phonics. Will the software engineers of the next century, writing the most sophisticated computer programs, be our graduates, or those from Germany, India, or Uzbek? Are our political institutions intelligently grappling with real problems like these and challenges, addressing the long-term needs of what I would call the next Oregon, or simply focusing on short-term fixes to get us through the next election cycle? I think as we contemplate this session, we should recognize that, in a sense, 1 million Oregonians have already answered that question by sitting out the last election. 43% of our eligible population last November didn't vote, a record in a presidential year. Now, you can't exactly blame that on a lack of choices. There must have been there were 23 ballot measures on the ballot. Too little information. I saw a 2-volume voters pamphlet was about the same length as War and Peace, although arguably the plot was a bit more difficult to discern. If you look at Oregonians between the ages of 18 and 30, most affected by our decisions, they'll live here longer, 2 out of 3 are not voting. If you think of politics as a product, its manufacturers are rapidly losing their market share. Some of their best customers are dying off. Even the evil marketing geniuses of the tobacco companies understand the importance of hooking the young. And in a very basic sense, this amounts to unilateral disarmament in a rapidly changing, if not dangerous, world. If you stop and think about today's class of 2000, most born in 1982, a year in which the personal computer, fax machine, internet, cellular phone didn't exist. Maybe not even those yellow sticky Post-it notes that we see everywhere. The world today, one in which national borders are increasingly gone, where people are competing for not just manufacturing jobs, but the most sophisticated. Now, of course, when I talk about participation, I sometimes run into people, often do, who say, Phil, maybe it's not such a bad thing that we have 1 million people not voting. After all, many people really aren't that informed about issues. They don't have the chance to be, or maybe they just don't care about it. You know, it might even make the situation worse. And it's very understandable, that sentiment. Very thoughtful people I know have reflected it to me. But I ultimately reject it because in a democratic system as ours, those who sit out are ultimately not accountable either. They're not part of the problem, they're not part of the solution. They have no stake in a candidate, in a cause, in their success or failure, or an alternative vision. And as more and more people drift out of the playing field, into the bleachers, and maybe even out of the stadium, it's not as if the political arena is left empty. It is peopled, all right, but left increasingly to participants who are motivated often by very strong feelings, often about just single issues. Often issues that I think reflect what I would call the politics of the passionate periphery. Some of those hot-button issues are familiar. They involve social issues from abortion and gun control, gay rights, gay marriage, issues like gun control, issues where considerable groups with clout in campaigns have very strong feelings, whether it's credit unions versus banks, issues of tenure, restaurant owners and labor on tip credits and minimum wage. Now, all of us have views on these things, many very heartfelt, including myself. But these, I would argue, are not central to the challenge posed by the senior from Uzbek, They are not going ultimately to have a primary effect on the quality of our schools, the vibrancy of our economy and culture, clean air, uncongested streets, our natural environment. But they do motivate candidates to run. They do reward candidates who adhere to the cause. And they do set up dynamics that I think very much provide the context for the legislative session that just ended. Ones in which rigid absolute declarations, no new taxes, no Medicare cuts, can make campaigns victorious, but make it increasingly difficult to actually govern. Where fear and crisis, not opportunity and possibility, become the coin of the realm. Your pocketbook, your safety, your values, your kids are all in danger, the commercials blare. And little wonder that people then become inclined to believe the worst of government. The victor is not a liberal agenda or a conservative agenda, but an anti-government agenda, which I would argue is profoundly different. It is to transform citizens, who are the ultimate bosses in our system, into feeling as if they were victims. We can't make a difference, so many exclaim. And it's in part because those on the playing field want them to think that. And so the ever-spiraling vicious circle. As more and more voters drop out, the dynamic merely feeds on itself. The passionate end up having even more clout. How to break that cycle? How to, in a sense, energize what I will later call the radical middle is indeed, I think, the challenge above all else that the 1997 legislature put down to us. And its importance, I would argue, is one in which, in a sense, we have little choice but not to do this. For what is so special about Oregon, what we have appreciated, whether we are fourth generation or whether we arrived here last month, is, I believe, truly something that hangs in the balance. After all, 20 years ago, did we seriously contemplate and imagine $500,000 condos springing up like Scotch broom and locked, gated communities up and down the Oregon coast? That we would seriously contemplate closing 62 parks? Did we think that a college degree would actually be less of a guarantee of prosperity than a high school diploma was just a generation ago? That our students would be less and less able to attend college and more coming out with debts of $20,000 or $50,000? So fast is the world changing. To look at the next 15 years is to reinforce that however calm the winds may be and sunny the weather, a politics that stays in familiar and safe harbors is, I believe, a politics that will be less and less relevant to more and more people and make these fundamental challenges more difficult to address. Which gets us to the backdrop for this 1997 session. Now, it's really tempting, of course, to let loose on all sorts of things. I think everybody here has complaints and the like about the legislature. We should temper that with the recognition that it's probably one of the most popular and easiest sports in America to bash our elected officials in the legislature. I ran across an article I wrote back in 1979 for that staid, uncontroversial, and eminently open-minded publication, Willamette Week. I analyzed the session, then dominated by Democrats, and the headline was, "Lots of motion, little movement." I portentously concluded. Sound familiar? As one person told me, journalists like you love to come in after the battle's over and shoot the survivors. You always run the risk, too, because there are so many extraordinary, talented, and committed individuals in that body. Republican and Democrat alike. People for whom public service is as near and as dear to them as anything else, and whose commitment to the integrity of that process truly shines. But I think when you look at the achievements and what the legislature did and didn't do, first of all, I think it is telling that on the three major things that will be most talked about, K through 12 education, the Oregon Health Plan, and the Coho restoration package. All very worthy achievements. But all of them, in no small part, achievements because of things outside the legislature's control. Funding K through 12 education at $4.2 billion, with perhaps another $150 million more in bonds, is far, far more than people expected at the beginning of the session. Credit many things. First and foremost, in my mind, the extraordinary leadership of the School Funding Now Coalition, business leaders right here in this community, parents, concerned citizens. But while it's good to be good, it's also perhaps even better to be lucky. $400 million more in revenues after 47 passed that were projected for the next biennium. The Oregon Health Plan, it was greatly expanded. We now are one of the leaders in the country in insuring children because of it. But only after voters did the heavy lifting and approved a cigarette tax hike, notwithstanding a $4 million campaign against it. And then only after Senate Republicans actually tried to diminish the expansion by diverting the money elsewhere. The Coho Plan, a true bipartisan effort. Applauds to Governor Kitzhaber, Speaker Lundquist, Senate President Adams, to restore watersheds and protect salmon. But could that have happened if the federal government hadn't dangled the possibility over our heads of a listing of the Coho? In other areas, victory was declared for things that I think, unfortunately, are all too small. $8 million to freeze higher education tuition takes the sting out of an 80% hike over the last 6 years. And it's a step, but really left undone were much larger issues of governance, how to deal with the needs here in the metropolitan area, faculty retention. With parks, promised $105 million in bonds, but interest costs will take $70 million of that in addition, just to pay interest and financing. And that's even if future legislators keep the promise, which they're not obligated to do. And then a number of issues that structurally had the ability to have a long-term effect, everything from how we run our elections to the roads we drive on, but which did have some short-term risks to people, afraid of being labeled anti-populist or pro-tax. Reform of the initiative process. 80 bills, none passed. Some of them proposed by the City Club. Annual legislative sessions, dead on the last day. Modifying term limits. Think of this for a moment. Next session, if every senator who runs gets reelected, only 10 of 90 will have served prior to 95. Only 10. That was not offered for reconsideration. And of course, the transportation package. To me, the most telling thing about this session was how the whole became so much less than the parts. Over and over again, this session had the chance to think long-term, to break out of responding to the politics of the passionate periphery, even to make history. And over again, it declined. Here we are in the 12th year of the most unprecedented economic expansion that many of us have ever lived through. Previous experience tells us that it's at exactly times like these that in some ways we have more freedom to think outside the box, to raise unconventional ideas, to show some courage on some things, to have a dialogue with Oregonians when they're not preoccupied with whether they can keep their jobs and recessions that we've previously lived through. And there are so many illustrations of, in a sense, sinking to the occasion. Whether it's transportation, our failure to do anywhere as much as we should with human resources and prevention, juvenile delinquency issues, you name it. But two I want to particularly focus on. One involving Oregon's natural heritage, and the second, the legacy that are of importance of our people, our education system. Our green infrastructure, as it were, is everything from parks to natural areas to wildlife habitat to watersheds. Our parks were once the crown jewel of the nation and now are tattered and frayed. We haven't built a new state park campground in 20 years. Tent camping's almost as expensive as paying for motel rooms. Opportunity after opportunity, an easement to guarantee beach access here, a potential new state park site there, slipped through our fingers because we literally have nothing in the cupboard. And across Oregon, there are watersheds in need of rehabilitation, hundreds of thousands of acres of once thriving forests, now brush, that could be rehabilitated. Ranchers who want to do the right thing on protecting stream sides, but can't afford $5,000 a mile to fence. And increasingly a natural landscape that divides us, where once it was what united us. Too many ways, politics that resemble World War I. Casualties are high. Ultimately, little territory is gained. The $30 million Coho plan recognized this, but even that disappears June 30th, 1999. There are no future guarantees, nor does it address the other needs. And an initiative that would try to invest where our values are would also, I believe, go so far to bridge a very deep chasm between rural and urban Oregon, to try to heal and try to find common ground among people who are often at each other. A broad-based revenue source that would ask each and every one of us to contribute, and maybe tourists too, to keep this legacy not only alive but strong. Now, there's no perfect revenue source dedicated fund on this. Everything has its opponents. But I thought Governor Kitzhaber came up with one of the better ones, proposing that Oregon's icon of sensible environmentalism do double duty into the next quarter century. It was a bipartisan idea embraced by the likes of people like Stubbs Stewart, a former Republican legislator, timber owner, former chair of the Association of Oregon Industries. And it had the potential to bring grocers into the equation, to add a small tax, but to give handlers fees for grocers, maybe even get them out of the stores with redemption centers, and provide permanent funding for everything from parks to natural areas. Senate Majority Leader, though, mid-session, explaining why the bill wasn't even going to get a hearing. Public doesn't want another tax to support parks. Though an Oregonian poll showed by a 67 to 32% margin, that's exactly what they did in supporting this. I contrast this failure this session to what happened a half century ago when Oregon voters were given the chance, just given the chance, to approve $13 million in bonds to reforest the Tillamook burn. We were a much poorer state then. Many people thought we could not afford that, but we did it. The value of the foresight estimated at $6 billion plus, not to mention the environmental and recreational benefits. I would argue that because we do not have the vision to see that far, we today are the much poorer state. The second area that I think reflects the larger failures and the power and the fear that abounds on issues of importance is what happened and didn't happen in K through 12 education. Yes, we did pass a historically high budget, but recognize where it puts us. Assuming these bonds are approved in November, no sure thing. Statewide, our per pupil spending will be almost $600 less than it was in 1990 when inflation and enrollment is taken into account. And if those bonds fail, it would be closer to $1,000 less. We struggled mightily to try to get some way, part way back to where we had been. And that failure reflects what we couldn't even have a conversation about this time. Why do we need a school year that still acts as if it's 1897 and the farm work beckons? Teachers tell you how much of the fall they spend just catching students up. When preschool programs like Head Start are such proven shrewd investments, conservative businessmen talk about what a good value that is. And yet fewer than half the eligible kids for Head Start are served, much less hundreds of thousands who could benefit. In a globalizing economy, even college students, often college-bound, don't have opportunities for foreign languages, much less others. remember talking to Sherman County Judge Mike MacArthur last year about the issue of foreign languages in his county. And he noted wryly that the only foreign language we have left to cut at Sherman High is English. If smaller class sizes are embraced by Democratic and Republican governors alike, and California's Pete Wilson is the latest convert, why do we let them increase? Especially as more and more kids bring more and more problems to school. 30% of our kids now, close to, are born into single-parent families starting off, and the difficulty of parents and the kids in those kinds of situations are manifold. Okay, this sounds like a traditional Democrat, I suppose. Just spend a lot more money on education. And I say I plead guilty, absolutely. In fact, far, far more than even the 4.3. But it is also critical that we recognize that we can't get from here to there without also talking about education reform. I thought the debate on this was really pathetic. Bill Graves did a riveting Oregonian series on Marshall High School that I know many of you read on the class of 2000. Only half the students will graduate from there 4 years later. Now, they don't all drop out, but it tells you something that a $4 billion a year system really can't even tell where everybody ends up, graduates as well as dropouts. Ford Motor Company can keep track of my Explorer a lot better than that. Standards. We are striving, and we should recognize the valiant work that teachers, parents, administrators are doing. But just 1/4 of our 8th graders projected to meet the new math standards. Far too many college students taking remedial courses to meet high school standards that are still much lower than they are in those other countries. The teacher tenure debate was, I think, very revealing, because it was remarkable how both sides, as opposed as they were, teachers and those advocating the change, in the end embraced the same, I think, tired assumption. The quarrel was over how much leeway to give administrators, but the assumption was that administrators should have to continue to perform the function of evaluating teachers. Yet if it is truly a profession, and it truly is, why are we not talking about identifying Oregon's best teachers and a fair process, giving them more responsibility and more pay, including asking them to make those judgments about their own? Instead, we have discussions about military recruiters on campus, consolidation, charter schools, phonics. Don't get me wrong, I love phonics. I got a 6 and a 4-year-old. Could you imagine what the debate would have been like this session if we had not talked about 4.1 or 4.3 billion, but maybe 4.5 or 4.7, but had said to Oregonians, it's a package. More resources, but also some fundamental change. I would argue that such a vision, and many did articulate at the Oregon Business Council and others, would have allowed us to break out of the education policy cul-de-sac we have been mired in for decades. Conservatives who say you can't spend more money until we have reform, and others say it's unfair and harmful to do that without providing more resources. Indeed, a recent poll by Davis and Hibbett showed Oregonians almost evenly split. Roughly half say, before we can improve quality, we need more money, and the other half saying, before we can give more money, we must improve quality. I think you get one shot in a legislative session to go to Oregonians and say, I know some of you will hate this. It's risky. You may even think it breaks a promise. But we think it's worthy for you to discuss and to debate it and to make a conscious choice. Do you want to take a one-time tax cut and perhaps invest it, and here's the deal? That was not the high-risk, contentious, controversial question that this legislature decided to refer. The one they did decide to refer, epitomizing the politics of the passionate periphery, was revoting on physician-assisted suicide. Yet for all of this, believe it or not, I am actually an optimist. And I'll tell you why. I have seen Oregonians time and again overcome these kinds of dynamics. But I would argue that a key to a politics of possibility, a politics that's a good deal more interesting, particularly to younger voters, lies in what might be called reasserting the radical middle in our politics. What am I talking about? Well, some of these are citizens who say none of the above. when the parties come courting. 1990, there were 160,000 independents. Today, there are 400,000. Yet only half voted in the last election compared to three-quarters of the others. Now, we don't know enough about these voters, but they're more in their 30s, I'd imagine, than in their 50s or 70s, more in the high-tech and entrepreneurial economy than the traditional blue-collar and corporate management world. If anything, they're more skeptical of government, more apt to believe the worst, but also not ones motivated by a lot of the litmus test issues. They're concerned about quality of life, as we all are, the natural environment, the world their kids are growing up in. And from the standpoint of traditional party politics, they are unpredictable as hell. The November 1996 election, I did some rough analysis. I said, let's look at the 15 counties that have 90% of the population, and I compared the vote that Bill Clinton and Tom Berger got. Clinton won big, Berger lost. The votes were almost identical. It seems that a lot of people went and voted for Ross Perot or Ralph Nader for president, turned around, voted for Gordon Smith for Senate, voted in support of Measure 47 to cut their property taxes, then voted to expand the Oregon Health Plan with an increase in cigarette taxes, and to top it all off, gave Oregon the highest minimum wage in the country by 1999. Go figure that one out on a traditional Republican or Democratic spectrum. It's not just the independents, and it's not just those who belong to parties and care, but who are independent-minded. I think it's also the younger citizens who have the candor to recognize there are a lot of issues that need discussion, convenient fictions that need to be recognized, but politicians are too scared to talk about it. I find it fascinating that whenever I talk to students or 20-year-olds, they always invariably know the answer to the question, what's the single biggest tax that most working people now pay? It's not income or property, it's Social Security and Medicare tax. It's also very revealing that when you ask how many think the programs will even exist when they retire, it's happened at Boys State recently with 400 students, 3 of them raised their hands. Maybe they misunderstood the question. I call these voters middle because they are not in either camp. I call them radical in the best sense of the word. I think they have the ability to see through the superficial rhetoric and posturing to get to the root of some of these issues. While they may confound the parties, this is the dynamic I would argue we need, and rather than push them away, we should be nurturing them and trying to engage them. Because throughout our history, they've helped politicians and leaders push the envelope, to take the risk to be first, because to stay in the traditional ruts may be safe, but the issues were too important. Public ownership of our beaches, enacting the first gas tax to pay for roads and parks, land use planning, the Oregon Health Plan. These have all been things that I think this radical middle has helped create. And yes, even vote by mail. I know you're wondering if I was ever going to get to that. I don't want to dwell on it. I have been a big advocate. I also think that the failure of this legislature, the state Senate in particular, to even let Oregonians vote on voting by mail, epitomized what so many of them come to hate about politics: double standards, partisan posturing, situational ethics, and they've seen it with both parties. But I don't support vote by mail and have become such a strong advocate because it saves money, or because it makes elections less confusing, or people can sit down and go through all those ballot measures. These are all very true, I think, and very good reasons. But my enthusiasm for it is born out of curiosity. It is a way, I think a significant way, though just one, to reach out and engage these people that I would argue hold the key to what is more possible in our politics. If we had had a participation rate in 1996's election equal to the one in 1992, 84% turnout then, we would have had 300,000 more people voting than who voted. But their influence actually would have been much greater than even that suggests, because the people who do vote, they tend to have stronger allegiances to parties, to particular causes. 300,000 people perhaps added to an equal number who did, what issues would they have demanded that politicians address? Would they be conventionally liberal or conservative, some strange combination? I don't know. It's why I want to find out, and why I think leaders of both parties have been so nervous in the past, because they don't know. Now, this isn't the only reform that I think we need. It's clearly time to let primaries be open to independent voters. That's as good for involvement, it is good for the parties. It is also clear that we need campaign finance reform that encourages candidates to run with large bases of people and not relying on a handful of PACs and relatively wealthy donors, whether they're liberal, conservative, or neither. In fact, imagine if every City Club member decided for the next 1998 election cycle to contribute $100 or $200 to candidates running for the legislature that are worthy. Well, first of all, you'd probably have a clout that exceeds that of most political action committees, and you'd probably also make some people around the state really nervous. Many, many things have to happen, I believe, as we look ahead to the 1999 legislature, to give Oregonians the politics that they deserve. But it starts ultimately with us. For us as consumers of a product we increasingly do not like, as recipients and listeners of campaign commercials that increasingly seem like static turned up to ear-screeching volumes, increasingly up to us to try to reframe the discussion, to give and empower those who would take the risks and see past the next election cycle the ability to do so. I ask finally for your help, for those of us in office, those of us who want to be, to help us look further, to ask us to think not just about phonics, but about Uzbekistan, to reflect on what Tom McCall once encapsulated very briefly in his rallying cry of keeping Oregon, Oregon. Neither conservative nor liberal, but ultimately radical, more difficult than it sounds and looks, a challenge that has never been more difficult to achieve, but also one that has never been so important to succeed at. Thank you very much. I'll just stay here and let Dan fire away.
I guess I need to get up here, Phil, so that my question can be heard. No, you can't leave. You gotta stay
Dan,
here.
you're suddenly taller than him.
Yeah, that's the only way I can do it. Phil, you've made a very eloquent and a very accurate picture, depicted a very accurate picture of what had happened, what's wrong with our legislative process. The City Club recently has come out with 2 reports addressing problems of the legislative process. One of them addressed to the structure of the legislature, which called for annual sessions so that the interim period between sessions could be used to ripen legislation, to give it consideration, to give people a chance to participate, so that we would not have this crazy last-minute rush that we see in the legislature when all kinds of wild things go through. So that was one of the recommendations. The other report of the City Club was addressed to initiative reform, and there we have seen these dramatic cases of initiatives loaded with unintended consequences, fraught with all kinds of problems, and we sought to get recommended some kind of initiative reform. Now, bills were introduced, bills were before the legislature, supported by no less a figure than the Republican Speaker of the House, and yet nothing happened. My question is, why did nothing happen? what happened, what really went on in the legislature to defeat those very important recommendations that would have dealt with improving the legislative process.
Dan, the observations you make are exactly right, and I think it will go down as one of the more regrettable lapses of this legislative session, because in many respects this was one of our best opportunities. We've come off of 32 initiatives in the last 2 cycles. About half the ones that have gone to court have been declared unconstitutional in whole or in part. Oregonians cherish the initiative process. They will not do away with it, nor should they. But as I talk to people around the state, they think it is not working as well as it could be. They want reform. Even the most simple steps. Founder, Speaker Lynn Lundquist, had a bill that said, let's just simply have the legislative lawyers review it ahead of time, hold public hearings, identify problems, maybe even constitutional issues. Didn't get past committee. We wanted to have disclosure of where the money comes from during the signature gathering. It's a huge business now. $2.5 million last cycle, some people making $1,000 a day. Who's paying them? Where's it going? Just as a disclosure issue. Didn't get anywhere. I think what you have, in effect, is people who, in a sense, have sowed the seeds of this politics that, in which negativity and suspicion and sometimes even paranoia reigns. You just can't trust the government, and then you, in a sense, reap the whirlwind. They become afraid and skittish that they will be accused of trying to undercut the public will. And yet, how the ethics are so situational in this regard. Unable to ask people to reconsider, modify the term limit bill, unable to ask them how they might want to improve their initiative, but willing in so many other cases to take on things that were passed through the initiative, trying to change the minimum wage law, physician-assisted suicide. And the latter, I think, really reflects the the double standard that in turn makes people less and less sympathetic to those issues. Measure 50, which narrowly passed, which people fought fiercely over. Even the proponents admitted there were flaws, and the legislature says, okay, our duty is to fix the flaws, send it back out to people for their consideration, and hope it passes. And it did, and it was a good thing. Yet with Measure 16, we know it has flaws. We won't fix them. We want to refer it back exactly as written and hope then that it fails. Whether you're for or against that, and I know people have very strong feelings, that double standard creates an atmosphere which makes it all the more difficult to have a dialogue with people over things that must happen. Term limits should have gone out. This session in some ways was a walking advertisement for modifying the limits, not doing away with them, but asking voters to modify them, given the inexperience, and added the length of the session, and I also think it left major issues undone. But in that volatile stew of increasing public disillusionment and cynicism, these issues fell by the wayside, I think, because of fear that they would fall victim of some of the dynamics of their own creation.
David Wu, City Club member. Mr. Secretary, you and I respectfully disagree about the vote by mail issue. And I say respectfully because the last time we spoke about it by telephone, after we both hung up, I wrote your campaign a check.
You sent it through the mail, I think.
A small check. But unfortunately, it's become a bit of a partisan issue, and I think that you and I probably disagree for other reasons. You view it as a voter turnout issue, and I view it as a vote going to the polling place as a secular sacrament, if you will. Is there a reason that we can't have both, that we both vote by mail and vote at the polling place? It may cost a little bit more, but nobody really minds if we upgrade the wine and the bread at a church service. So And I suspect that the cost of voting is not that big in all governmental operations.
I've actually always thought the best argument against vote by mail was that many people do feel that sense of community. It's a ritual of the democratic process, and it means something to them, and I very much respect that. In fact, I miss it. I do on one level. But the argument has changed profoundly from what it was several years ago. Several years ago, those were the choices, polling place versus vote by mail. Today, the choice has gotten down to hybrid elections where half to two-thirds to three-quarters vote absentee anyway, and then a declining portion go to the polls at an additional cost of $3-4 million. Here we are asking where we're going to come up with money for libraries. That's county money. The legislature tells your county officials, you cannot run a vote-by-mail election. We're going to prohibit it. Situational ethics, when the legislature decides to hold a special election on controversial issues, it makes them vote-by-mail election and saves the state $1 million, then forces the counties to spend $4 million and compete with other needs. But I think the final point I'd make on that is that vote-by-mail, in a sense, does give people the choice, and perhaps we need to do a better job of getting this out. Vote by mail, in effect, simply gives people the ballot through the mail. It doesn't tell them how to vote it. It gives them the choice. They can vote by sending it back through the mail, and most do. But we found in small rural counties, in particular in eastern Oregon, in the special Senate election, as many as 35% took their ballots into a drop site, to the county courthouse. Maybe they wanted to say hello to their neighbors or check on some other business or just have the certainty that their ballot got there. But the vote-by-mail system that we've proposed gives people that choice. I think it's no small irony that when all was said and done, the proponents of vote-by-mail this session compromised early on. We will settle for a vote on the issue, and let's just let Oregonians decide how they want to run their elections and how they want to spend their money. They might decide they want an more expensive dual system. But that was what did not occur. When we had our only key vote in the Senate, it was a procedural move. We fell 2 votes short. All 3 Republican senators who got up to blast vote by mail had voted 2 years previously to actually enact vote by mail, including the sponsor of the bill in '95, Senator Randy Miller. And we, again, never got a chance to have a clean vote on it. And the irony is it probably will be on the initiative, as it turns out, which I think is a huge waste of time, money, and energy as far as the initiative is concerned. But I think that is inevitably what will happen.
Thane Tenson, member of the club. Well, Phil, as usual, you provide a lot of food for political thought, and actually, your very last statement was going to be my question, because there's been, looking at the last 10 years of political activity in this state, it seems to me that increasingly the legislature has become marginalized. Most of the big policy issues, with the exception perhaps of the Oregon Health Plan and something I'm not thinking of, have been decided or at least spurred by the initiative process. That process, in turn, has been dominated by people who operate outside the political mainstream, the Bill Sizemores, the Kevin Mannixes, the Osbergs, people that aren't thought of, at least traditionally, as representing the political mainstream in Oregon. Given the fact that the legislature, and this session is exemplary of that, has been increasingly reluctant to address those same important political issues, and even when it confronts them, it refers them to the voters. I'm wondering if it isn't time to think about having people like yourself, who represent in large part the political mainstream, think about utilizing the initiative process, at least on a limited basis, to resolve some of these issues, like vote by mail, like opening up the voting process to independents and like, because you know darn well they're unlikely to ever be coming out of the legislature. Is that something that's probably heretical to think about, but what do you think about it, Bill?
Thane, I don't think it's heretical, and I think you'll see more and more people doing it. One interesting thing last time was only 4 initiatives ended up passing, and 2 of them were seen from pretty conventionally more liberal than conservative camps. The increase in the minimum wage, the increase in cigarette taxes to expand the Oregon Health Plan. Obviously, I believe it should be a last resort. But let's recognize that it is a tool, others are using it, and if those who have a positive vision of Oregon are consigned to solely play defense, and in a sense you start out already playing on weak ground. And I think at the ballot there are issues that you can win that you, in a sense, can't, or it's much more difficult in the legislature. And some of these issues, the public is ahead of where legislators are. For example, permanent dedicated funding for parks, which I mentioned earlier. So I think you will see more of it. I hope we temper it, or advocates of causes that we might believe in temper it and don't overuse it. And for goodness sakes, don't lock everything into the Constitution as much as you might be tempted to. You know, we're turning our basic framework document into a corkboard with Post-it notes and thumbtacks all over it, 2,000-word prison industry requirements, things that have utterly no business belonging there. And when you look at a legislature that does at least act like it might change these things, it only reinforces the desire of, boy, we better get it in that Constitution so it can't be tampered with. And it's very important to resist that, because we need to be taking stuff out of the Constitution that's in there and reasserting some very, very basic rules of the democratic process in so doing.
Secretary Keisling, I'm Ray Polani, City Club member. I was going to ask how you felt about opening up the primary process entirely, and you answered that before. So I'm going to fall back on another question, and I guess it'll have to be transportation. The transportation package of added taxes failed twice in the Senate. First on the 3 cents and then on the 2 cents, or 9 and 6 respectively. And it presumably failed because there was distrust for what the Department of Transportation was doing with the money. The same Department of Transportation that keep telling us that we can't build ourselves out of congestion and so on. And yet the legislature failed to ask the people how they would feel about giving the broader authority of using the funds for transportation instead of just for highways.
Right.
And so we had the spectacle at the last minute of scrounging around for some money to keep rail service in the valley rather than perhaps widening I-5. And we also saw the other spectacle that didn't happen, and that is the preservation of service of the train east in the I-84 corridor. Why do you think there is this reluctance to let the people look again at the constitutional restriction?
Well, the first question is the reluctance to ask people to revisit the constitutional restriction. Of course, that has been a theme of most legislatures I've ever seen. We took it out in 1980. I don't think we ever even asked it back, even when the Democrats controlled. Personally, I thought it was a big mistake, or personally, I think that we should ask that to happen. In 1980, we actually didn't take it out. We narrowed it, took parks out. But this legislature couldn't even obviously get to the point of a penny gas tax increase to invest. And I found something very interesting in the debate as it unfolded in the Senate, and it fell way short. It was 5 votes short. What was interesting to me was not so much that people argued we really don't need it. Gee, the potholes aren't that bad, the roads aren't that bad, or heck, maybe we ought to not even build the things. Nor did I find the argument very much being, well, we really do need it, but this is the wrong way to go about it. Let's work at it again. Over and over again, it was as if we need to punish ODOT for its past mistakes, real or perceived, DMV computer, hiring a former legislator. We did audit work that was critical of some decisions made. But we need to punish them. We should not reward them with our tax dollars. And you stop and think about this us versus them, in which, though we are in charge ultimately, the governor's accountable to us, the legislative process, etc., anyone who works at ODOT, is that it's they, and to protect ourselves, we deny them that. Well, I think the real costs, obviously, ultimately were the victims in that sense, because our cars will need to be repaired more. We will lose time, we will lose economic development opportunities, the mobility issues that get beyond roads and highways and the like. But I can imagine what is going on in some people's minds. You vote for this, and your opponent will have a statement in a campaign brochure, so-and-so supported the biggest tax hike in Oregon history. And I think as people weighed the dynamics of this, they found it, in a sense, safer and, in their own mind, an achievement to say no on this score. And I guarantee you, you will hear that talked about in the next campaign. Now, I think they underestimate the broad bipartisan support for this package. It was crafted very carefully over a year and a half. I think most people thought the issue would be, what's the details as opposed to whether it passes. I think there could be a backlash. But as far as an explanation that I can go, I think they work themselves into the mindset of, we've got to send a message. But again, the message ends up, if anything, hurting Oregonians more than anything else. One more question.
From me.
From you. Terrific.
An unknown person here at the head table has suggested that I ask Secretary Keisling whether or not he would care to comment on the failure of the legislature to tap into the kicker as a means of solving some of the problems he's told us about.
When I served in 1989, we had the chance to modify the kicker law, and we didn't. All subsequent sessions haven't either. I think it is just an awful public policy to base decisions on projections 2 years in advance that are so hard to hit. Now, the issue of the kicker this time, I very much supported the governor in proposing that we retain the kicker to reach adequate school funding. What then happened during the session was, as the revenue forecast went up, I think it fundamentally changed the potential debate we could have had. By that time, though, both leaders were pretty adamant, no way, no how, and it sort of disappeared. But I thought that we maybe missed an opportunity to say, now that we think we can do this for schools without the kicker, either to tie the kicker to education reform, as I talked about in my speech, or to say there are some one-time capital needs in this that we have right now, and we can decide whether to borrow the money and pay lots of interest costs, the MasterCard method of financing, whether it's for parks, which I mentioned, or repaying the Safe Corporation for a foolish rate on it 10 years ago, we're still paying the money back for. Whatever, one-time capital needs, and tie it to that. The best businesses know that when they have good years, it is important to reinvest in future productivity, get some things out of the way, repair, maintenance, new plant equipment, etc. That kind of business sense did not seem to animate the debate from the get-go. It was, we've got a sacred pact to return it. I think if you felt that strongly about it, why didn't we simply ask people what they wanted to do with it? But I felt that it was responsible public policy to at least consider keeping part or all of the kicker, but have the debate about what the needs were, capital, long-term, and otherwise. And I think, again, it's a failure of the legislature that even that debate couldn't occur. The framework did not exist for it. Instead, it was, you in favor of a one-time tax cut or not. And the result of it, I think, just adds to the missed opportunity of this particular legislative session. And finally, and the failure too, Lynn Lundquist again deserves credit. He said, let's think ahead. Let's not just keep revisiting this biennium after biennium. Let's do something like a rainy day fund. Some mechanism that we at least say, we'll send it back now, but let's think ahead in the future. Again, even that failed to pass. We will simply postpone the same debate for yet another day, and I think that's very unfortunate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank.
Well, all of us want to thank you, the Honorable Phil Keisling, for taking your time to discuss these things with us from your perspective. I can assure you that you can count on the City Club to do their best to activate the radical middle. And thank you all for coming, and we do stand adjourned.